right, should be good to go. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to probably going to be a little bit of a shorter day today. I didn't want to give you a new reading that we wouldn't be able to really cover today. So we're going to finish talking about the way in which Platonic thought gets incorporated into, we already did Jewish thought. We're going to finish talking about it with respect to early Christian thought, especially through Dionysius the Areopagite, who will be the primary person that we talk about today. And then I'll begin doing a little bit of work about setting up the role Platonic thought plays in the development of Islamic thinking. And Dionysius will be helpful for that because it's basically him or of where Dionysius is coming from, that how Plato gets introduced into the Islamic world. So we'll do all that setup work today. And then next week on Tuesday, we'll start right in with Al-Farabi, who is an Islamic Platonist and who's going to give us a definition of religion. He actually defines religion really fast, but the thing that should sort of stagger all of this, again, I mentioned this last class, my hope is that you will all fall out of your chair once he actually, because he gives a really quick definition at first, right? But once he actually says what he thinks religion is, my hope is you will all be flabbergasted and fall and in shock. His claim, I'll just tell you what his claim is now. Actually, he's going to say that religion is philosophy translated into images that can be understood by the common person. And I want to make this very clear. He is an Islamic theologian. And that is his definition of religion. He is an Islamic theologian. And we'll need to see how it's operating, and because there's a whole bunch of other stuff, a bunch of ideas about what the political community is and how that relates to religion is built into this, what philosophy is and how it relates to religion is built into this. So we'll have a lot to say, certainly. We'll certainly take our time with it. So we'll start with him, and then we'll read the rejoinder to him by an Islamic theologian named Al-Ghazali, who is more indicative of the mainstream Islamic position about what it is that religion is. Al-Farabi is not mainstream, certainly. But even Al-Ghazali is actually going to be way closer to Al-Farabi than you would have guessed. So we're going to start next week turning to the Islamic world. I don't know if we'll be able to get it done next week. If we do, fine. If not, we'll spread it out a little bit. And then once we get done talking about what religion is in the Islamic world, we'll turn to what it is within the Buddhist world, or whether or not it is in the Buddhist world, whether or not Buddhism is or should be characterized as anything like a religion. And then that should take us reasonably close, my guess is, till the end of class, I think. So we're now starting our move into the non-Western world, finally. So that's the plan for the next little bit. Like I said, I'm going to try to get your papers graded over the weekend, or at least make good progress at getting the papers graded over the weekend. I know I'm behind on that, so I really apologize. I'm behind with lots of grading, so I apologize for all the being behind. I will try to get as caught up as quickly as I can. Yep, so I think that's all I have in terms of just introduction stuff. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments about anything? Or should we just get started? All right, great. Let us get going then. Let's just begin by doing review from last class. Ooh, that formatting went crazy. Let's try this. There we go. All right. So Platonic and Neoplatonic thought. Sorry, let me make sure something's working. Yeah, everything's working good. So Platonic or Neoplatonic. Neoplatonism is the movement that begins with Plotinus. He wouldn't have called himself a Neoplatonist, so I'm not going to worry about the difference. Platonic or Neoplatonic thought, it's not rooted in any sort of holy text or any sort of divine revelation. Right? Plato never says that God came down and told him any of this, nor does Plotinus. The forms, so these sort of basic transcendent principle in Platonism, are in principle knowable. Right? They're things that it's capable for us to understand. And the reason why Plato posits them for the first place is because he just thinks he needs them to solve certain kinds of philosophical problems. Things like, what is the nature of truth? What is the nature of predication? How can we understand why things change but still stay the same? There's puzzles about that. Various kinds of puzzles. The forms are supposed to be answers to these puzzles. That's why they're posited. Even when Plotinus posits the one, or the good, and the one isn't itself knowable, right? It transcends both the sensible and the intelligible, right? Or the knowable. It explains why the knowable world is the knowable world. But his reason still for positing this one, again, it's not the result of any sort of special divine revelation. His reasons for positing it are basically still philosophical. And again, I haven't really gone into any of that. So if you are interested, if you want to learn more about this Neoplatonism stuff, take medieval philosophy with me. I think it'll be offered next spring. And we'll spend a month on Plotinus, just trying to figure out what's going on with him. Why is he offering this sort of stance that he's taking? Okay, so when the Hebraic tradition, so by Hebraic tradition, I mean the Jewish, Christian, Islamic tradition, when it incorporates these Platonic ideas within itself, and it uses Platonic philosophy to help explain what it is that's being said within, say, the Tanakh, or within, say, the Gospel of John, St. Augustine literally says the first chapter of the Gospel of John, word for word, is just in Plotinus, as far as he's concerned. There's one line that's not, but with one minor little exception, almost word for word, the Gospel of John, the first chapter of the Gospel of John is just in Plotinus, he says. Things are going to have to change a little bit, though, because this Hebraic tradition is obviously going to need to leave a place for direct spiritual revelation, holy books, things of this sort coming from God. And this happens in different ways in different tradition, right? God spoke to Moses, and to Moses, the first 4 books of the Tanakh are, in some sense, coming from God, what Moses heard from God. Similarly, there are recordings of prophets who have heard from God within the Jewish tradition. Within the Christian tradition, the Gospels themselves are supposed to literally be recordings of the teachings of Christ, and Christ is God. So God quite literally talked to people, right, in the form of Christ, also in the form of the Bible itself. The Bible, once it gets codified around the 4th century or so, it's thought of as sort of like a divine stamp upon the books that God included into the Gospel, that all of them are in some sense coming from God. And then within the Islamic tradition, Muhammad, the prophet, does not speak with his own voice. When he is being the prophet, God is directly speaking through him. And since the Quran is just a recording of what Muhammad said, then the sayings of Muhammad are quite literally the sayings of God, God speaking through Muhammad. So we have to add a place for this sort of sense of holy revelation in, and it causes certain kinds of distortions, right? So when Plotinus talks about the one, that becomes God. When Plotinus talks about the forms, this becomes the mind of God, or the works of God, the activities that God does. And then, sorry, I didn't write that right. When we talk about then creation, that's supposed to be this sort of sensible world. Right? In Plotinus, remember, all of these things were of a fundamental unity. There weren't really different worlds in Plotinus, right? The one is the source of everything, right? But the intelligible, quote unquote, world, that's just an image or a reflection of that one, right? It's the source insofar as it's intelligible and knowable. The same thing is true about the sensible world. The sensible world is the source of all things insofar as they're perceptible. When this gets sort of translated, we draw a little bit of a harsher line. That really did not work. Okay. We draw a harsher line between the levels. Right? When there's a fundamental gap built into our ability, and this gap is actually, ironically, the most extreme in some of the pagan uses of Plato, but nevertheless, a rather large gap gets drawn between the sensible world and this now mind of God. There's limits to our ability to know the mind of God. And then that's where revelation fills in the blanks, right? Revelation in various forms and various different ways is God sort of coming down to us and telling us things, either just about the intelligible world itself, or telling us, in the case of certain parts of Christianity, telling us things about God himself, telling us things about the simple source that reason isn't capable of reasoning about. The reason could never learn about on its own, but God tells us these things. So we add a little bit more of a gap, but the basic sort of picture, at least in terms of ethics, doesn't change to any sort of great extent. The way that this is sort of getting characterized really strongly suggests that the goal of life is something sort of mystical, right? That what is it that will lead to human happiness, or what is it that will lead to human flourishing? It will in some sense be identifying myself, or coming to identify myself, not as this sensible created thing, but seeing myself as a kind of unity with God, attaining a kind of unity with God. And this takes various sorts of forms. right? In Jewish thought, this predominantly takes the form of the Kabbalah. That's the main Jewish version of this. But in Christianity, Christ himself says throughout the Gospels, right, that if you follow me, you will all become sons of God, right? You will all become unified with God through me, through associating with me. So it's not the same way that Plotinus thought it was going to work, but it is still the same ultimate end goal in a certain sense, a kind of, it's called heniosis, or union with God. And this is indeed still the case in the Islamic, for a lot of the Islamic philosophers too, though again, it's going to be a little bit more complicated in the Islamic context. All right, so that was what we were doing last time. So I just want to stop. That was just review from last class, so it was, I'm sure, quite a bit rushed. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we talked about last time? Anything from that review? Anything people would like to get a little bit cleared on before we turn to Dionysus? Again, I know it's always dangerous. I'm interpreting your silence as understanding, which is a very dangerous assumption. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to share this. This is just a little joke, I guess. I don't know how many of you are still here in Colorado, but we got, I think we're getting close to 2 feet of snow in the past 16 hours. So first good thing from the quarantine, totally would have had to cancel class today. So I guess, you know, lucky us, I guess, lucky, I guess, maybe, right? The first good thing coming from the quarantine, we were still able to meet today, which we otherwise wouldn't have. All right, so let's turn now to Dionysus the Areopagite. Dionysus is a fascinating figure. Before I even get to the whiteboard, I just want to sort of chat about who he is a little bit first. And actually, it's going to be kind of a short discussion because we have no idea who this guy is. Dionysus the Areopagite is a figure from the New Testament. He appears in one of Paul's letters. Paul says that when he went to Athens, Athens is where Plato is from, and it's sort of this renowned as the center of philosophy, right? So St. Paul says that when he goes to Athens to preach the word, it was really weird because most times when he goes to a place, people end up throwing rocks at him and trying to kill him. And the Athenians, because they're such a philosophical people, they just are used to people coming and saying all kinds of crazy things to them. Because that's what philosophers do. They just come and just say a bunch of crazy things in public. So everyone sort of just like listened in, a crowd sort of formed to listen to what crazy new things the Christians would say. And then at the end, they all just kind of laughed and was like, oh, you Christians are pretty crazy, and sort of wandered away. And St. Paul says in response to this, by the way, this is the best reception he's received anywhere in the pagan world. Like, this is the nicest reception he's received so far. But one person in attendance who listened to him became converted. And this was a man named Dionysus. Dionysus of the Areopagite, that's basically Dionysus of a particular part of Athens. Okay, so this is a New Testament figure. He doesn't show up again. He just has this one little mention of importantly, this philosopher, this person from Greece who was converted to Christianity. So then in 5th century, around the 5th century or so, a text appears in the Roman world that purports to have been written by Dionysus the Areopagite, so written by this biblical figure. This is impossible. The person who wrote this text could not have been the figure from the Bible. And the reason why it's impossible is this figure takes Proclus, who's the last pagan philosopher, and just literally copy pastes him at various junctures. And Dionysus and Proclus was writing in the late 5th century. So this could not be the person from the Bible unless Proclus was Dionysus the Areopagite, which isn't true. So he's not who he's claiming to be. This is not discovered for a very long time. For a very long time, people thought this was indeed a biblical source. It is not. And by the Renaissance, it's discovered that this person can't be who he's claiming to be. We have very little idea who he is. If you actually really dive into it, my favorite theory, and I like this theory just because it's so preposterous, I almost hope it's true. So right around 530 or so, 530 AD, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire finally forces the pagan Platonic Academy in Athens to close. This is usually considered to be the end of paganism, the end of the pagan world and the end of pagan philosophy with that event. One theory is that Dionysus the Areopagite is the last headmaster of the pagan academy, writing under a false name to smuggle pagan Platonic thought into Christianity. A little thought bomb thrown into the core of Christianity. I probably don't think this is true, because whoever this is knows Christianity really, really well, and it's doubtful that Damascius would have. But I like the idea, at least. At the very least, this is someone who is making it their explicit project to incorporate really sophisticated late Neoplatonic philosophy into Christianity. That would be another reason to choose the name Dionysus, right? Because that he is the philosopher who Christianized. So he's a fascinating figure for that. We don't have, there's two possibilities. Either we don't have very many of his writings, or he lied about a lot of the stuff that he claimed to have written. Like, he gives us this whole exhaustive bibliography of books that he claims to have written, and we have like 4 of them. So either he's making up books, which is certainly possible, or we've lost stuff. We don't have things that were written by this person, whoever it is. He's incredibly important. He's predominantly important in the Eastern Orthodox Church, not in the Catholic. So he's more of an Eastern figure than a Western one. And his importance in Eastern Orthodox thought is overwhelming and enormous. And through him, Eastern Orthodox thought remains thoroughgoingly Platonic. With obviously not pagan Platonic, right? There's differences, but it still maintains a pagan, a sort of Platonic air to it all the way through. But he's also rather important in the West too. And the reason he's important in the West more than anything else is because Saint Aquinas loves him. Saint Aquinas thinks he's great and treats him as an authority as well. And so then through him as well, a lot of Platonic thought gets into the Western Church, the Catholic Church too. So he's an overwhelmingly important figure, even though he's not like named that often. The influence of his thought is enormous. It spreads in all kinds of really subtle ways. Also, he's despised by the Protestants. When the Protestant Reformation happens, Calvin cannot go out of his way to disparage him more. And hates him precisely because Protestant thought is really opposed to a lot of the Platonic stuff. And today we'll actually start talking about why a little bit. Why Protestant thought is so opposed to paganism in a lot of respects. And Luther is the same way. Luther has nothing good to say about Dionysus the Areopagite. So let's start talking a little bit about Dionysus and his thought. He also gets called Pseudo-Dionysus because he's not actually who he's claiming to be. So if you see him by that name, that's the same guy. He also gets called Pseudo-Dionysus. Right. What Pseudo-Dionysus is most well known for is a distinction between what he calls positive and negative theology. Okay. Okay, so let's start defining some words a little bit. What is this word theology? I've said it before, but let's actually just define it. Theology is the study of God. That's what the word theology literally means. Okay. And Dionysus really clearly articulates 2 different methods to be used to get at God. And big picture upshot, why does all of this matter so much? I just want to give you sort of the punchline first. Because the existence of negative theology, it only makes sense in the context of a monastic practice. It doesn't really make sense outside of it. You would be engaging in the negative theology as a spiritual practice. Otherwise, you wouldn't engage in it at all. And so Dionysus's central importance, more than anything else, is in defining the scope of Christian monastic life. And again, this is more true in the Eastern Church, but it's even true in the Western Church. All right. So that's what we're going to try to really hammer down today. Let's go back a little bit. In Taylor, right? he was suggesting that the central difference between what religion meant in the Middle Ages and what religion meant starting with the Protestant Reformation and a little bit before it was the existence of these different speeds of religious life. You all remember this language? Is that you all remember this? I'll talk of the different speeds, right? So like there's the slow speed, right? People who actually wouldn't have even been called religious, right? The word religion was reserved for the faster speed, actually. But there's a slower speed of Christian life, at least, where you basically are just living your ordinary life. You want normal things. You want the crops to come in well. You want to not get sick. You want your family to be healthy. You want there not to be war and your community to be in good shape, right? You want these really basic things. And so then you take part in the life of the church as a way of sort of helping and ensuring this, right? So how does this happen? The church offers various sacraments that you can engage within. The church offers white magic in the case of the late Middle Ages, right? Where these sort of blessings and rituals that can keep out certain sort of harmful forces from harming you. This is what most people would have meant by being a Christian, right? The actual religious, though, were the people who took vows, the people who took special religious vows, which usually meant some kind of monastic vow. And this was the faster speed, the higher speed of religious life, Taylor was arguing, right? This sort of specialized vocation where you're now no longer concerned with all those ordinary everyday affairs, at least ideally you're not, right? You're not worried about dinner tonight. You're not worried about being healthy. You're trying to attain something else, some sort of higher vocation, right? What is the higher vocation? That's what we're going to define today. Because what happens with the Protestant Reformation, and even before it, there was a move against this in Catholicism, but the definitive characteristic of the Protestant Reformation is abolishing these different speeds of religious life. Right? Now there's just one religious life, being Christian, that everyone needs to live up to. So it's simultaneously we raise up the lower speed, but we also draw down the higher speed. Right? And this is explicit. Luther and Calvin directly despise monasticism and the very idea of monasticism. They are vehemently opposed to it, and they're vehemently opposed to what it's supposed to accomplish and what it's supposed to realize. What I want us to figure out today is what is it supposed to accomplish? What is it supposed to realize? Nietzsche gave us an answer. Nietzsche's answer was this anesthetizing activity to hide from the pain of life. Okay, maybe. But I want to figure out what it is they thought they were doing through these sort of monastic practices, and we're going to use Dionysus to try and help and make this as explicit as possible. That's going to be our goal for today. So any initial thoughts, questions, anything, or should I just dive into the Dionysus? Good for now? All right. Then let's dive into the mystical theology. And we're going to get weird. Advance warning, it's going to get weird. So let's dive into the mystical theology. Right? Mystical theology is basically an overview of Dionysus's thought, and it's also really short, which is why it's what I had you read. Right? So in the mystical theology, he's very straightforwardly, within the first couple lines, it just explains what it is he's basically after. And what he says is, this is a rough paraphrase, but I'm getting the line basically right from the Latin. Abandon yourself and everything. Let me make that really clear. Everything, right? In order to be uplifted to God. That's the goal. That's what we're seeking. That's what we're after with all of this. And that's what's ultimately going to explain the weird monastic life that the monastics live, right? Their goal is to abandon themselves and everything. Almost, I want to emphasize, like by everything, I mean like literally everything you can see, touch, feel, think about, talk about, know about. Abandon all of them in order to be uplifted to God. That's our goal here. All right. So what does he mean by God then? First of all, God is transcendent in a double sense. And we talked about this double sense last class, but I will just want to repeat it and remind us of it. He's beyond the sensible world. But he's also beyond what is possible to know. And in this, Dionysus is just being a good Platonist, right? This is Plotinus' one again. That's directly what he's describing, right? But the way Dionysus characterizes this means that the God that we're talking about is the hidden God. The mysterious God. Right? He actually says, I don't remember if he says this in the mystical theology, but in other places he calls him the dark God, right? The God of the shadows. Right? The God that you don't know, the God that is hard to find. Right? And the reason this is so important is that he thinks we have to be really careful to make sure that all of the fake Christians don't hear about this, or at least the Christians who aren't good enough to follow along with this, right? We have to avoid telling any of this to those who, and this is a quote, those who imagine that there is nothing beyond individual instances of being. Right? Which is to say, with those who think that God is something out there in the world. And people can be making this mistake in various sorts of ways. You could just have a really crass idolater who thinks that God is actually a physical thing, right? That would be falling prey to this danger. And it's actually that danger that St. Augustine says is the main thing that he learned from Platonic philosophy. Platonic philosophy had taught him how to avoid thinking of God as a physical thing. But we also have to just avoid thinking of God as an intelligible thing too. He's not a form. God is not a form, or all of the forms, or some of the forms. God is beyond that too, right? And people who aren't ready to understand this will not be able to follow Dionysus on the path that he is following. The higher speed of religious life, if you use the Taylor language, is reserved for those who have realized this. Right? Because if everyone was trying to do all of this, they wouldn't understand. Dionysus is in a couple pages going to go on to say just utterly bewildering things. He's going to say, like, God is not wise. God is not good. God is not just. And if you are not careful, you are not at all going to understand what it is that you're saying when you're saying any of those things, right? You're going to think he means one thing when in fact he means the exact opposite. By it, right? Monastic life is reserved only for the few who understand it. Now, anyone in principle could understand it, right? But most people just don't. This is why we need different speeds. The people on the lower speed, the people who can't understand this about God, right? They should just engage in normal practice. And they should avoid doing anything resembling theology. And it's for their own good. It'll just hurt them. People will just be harmed. People will just blaspheme. They'll say things that are even true, but they'll say them in a false way and end up just blaspheming if they were to take part in this sort of higher speed of life. The higher speed of life is a special vocation, and it's one you have to be fully committed toward to actually engage in. All right. Just want to check in. How are we doing? Any questions or thoughts right now? Everything's still going reasonably well at this point? All right. Let's start getting into some of the crazy stuff that he's going to go on to say on the basis of all of this. All right. Oh, go. Yeah, actually have a chat question. Go. Yeah. Go back. Where are you? There you are, Rachel. Go ahead. You're unmuted.
Oh, did they think, I couldn't remember, like, with the higher speed thing, did they think that if you're on, like, a lower speed, you were going to be, like, punished by the higher power because you weren't, like, the best that you could be in terms of, like, okay, so as long as you were in one of the speeds, you were fine, basically?
Exactly. I mean, this is an important distinction, and it's really helpful to remind us of all of this. For Dionysus and for all of these church fathers, the goal is to live as godlike of a life as possible for you. You're better off the more godlike your life can be, but to the extent that your God is lifelike at all, that's good, and that's admirable, and that's great. Right? So the people at the lower speeds, they're leading a God life like to the extent that they can. And there's no need to even talk about them being punished for it, because the punishment just is not being at the higher speed. But they're presumably fine with that. Right? And so there's not really anyone being punished exactly. Like, I mean, there is still talk of like hell a little bit, but hell is basically reserved for people who wouldn't be on any of the speeds. So if you're on any of the speeds, yeah, you're already doing the Christian thing. You're just not going to be able to attain the highest level of Christian practice, because the highest level of Christian practice is this sort of heneosis, or this unity with God. So does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Good. Any others? All right. Excellent. Then let us begin. And again, just send me the chat question or raise the thumbnail, the thumb or whatever to get my attention if need be. All right. So what can we say about this God, right? We've got this God who is hidden. What can we actually say? Well, the safest thing to say about God is that God is the cause. And so what things is God the cause of? Well, he's the cause of sensible things. So examples, rocks, fires, humans. Okay? He's the cause of those things and of intelligible things. Right? Being, truth, goodness, the form human being. He's the cause of both. So, okay, if our goal is to, in some sense, get closer to this God, God is beyond everything that he made. That's why God is not an instance of being. That's why God is this hidden God, this mysterious God, right? Because he's beyond all the things that he's made. But if we have to talk about him at all, we can talk about God in terms of the activities that we see that God has engaged within. We see, or we in some sense know, intuit that God is responsible for a whole bunch of stuff. So let's start talking about God by talking about what God is responsible for, what God has done. That's what we're going to call affirmative theology or positive theology. So what does this look like? Here we're actually going to actually try to characterize this mysterious hidden God when we're engaged in this affirmative theology. So how are we going to do it? Dionysus lays out this whole big long sequence, and he says he wrote books about all of these things, and we don't have most of them. Maybe we start with the things that God has directly revealed through Revelation. So what kind of things are we talking about here? We're talking about the Trinity, right? That somehow God is both 3 and 1 at the same time. Maybe we're talking about Christ and his special status in the incarnation. And other things of that sort. These are things that we know about God because God told us these things about himself. And it's important here, right? Almost this is just stuff we're allowed to say about God, because that's sort of the puzzle, right? Like if God is this thing that's beyond everything, it seems like any language I use to describe God is going to be inadequate to him. It's not going to get him right. So what can I say about God? Well, I'll just start by saying the stuff that God says about God, right? Or that God told us to say about him, for example, the Trinity, or things that Christ said, things of that sort, things of direct revelation, right? This is characterizing Plotinus as one. This is the thing Plotinus himself never would have done. This is that special sort of addition that I was suggesting that these Hebraic traditions need to add to Platonism. They need to add a place for revelation. That's what Dionysus is doing here. He's adding this place where the sort of mysterious teachings of Christianity, the things that reason doesn't give you, the things that Plato never said, the things that Plotinus never said, those things that we can say about the one because in some sense they come from direct revelation. We got got a question here about what I mean by the Trinity. Yeah, I mean the Christian or the Catholic Trinity, right? So let me clarify that. I mean Father, Son, Holy Ghost. That's what I mean here. That's what I mean. Okay. But also but there's still just one God. Okay. That's the mystery. That mystery is the one that I'm referring to with respect to the Trinity. Because somehow we have 3 persons, but still one God. So I hope that I hope that was a helpful clarification. Hope that clears it up. Yeah, it's not exactly what Philo was talking about. Philo's doing something Jewish, so he's doing something else. Right. So this is the first step. We can start. We'll just say the things that God told us we could say, but we don't have to stop there. We can talk about the intelligible categories, the intelligible activities that we see God engaged within. What activities do we infer that God has engaged in? What are these activities? Here I'm talking about things like being good, because the universe is good, so I can infer God as being good through his activity of having made a good universe. We can talk about God as being, right? Because God made things, so therefore he does being. He does a sort of being activity. We can talk about wisdom. God is wise because the universe is well constituted, well created. And again, Dionysus says here, it's still the case that God actually sort of gives us the okay for all of these, because all of these words appear in the Old and New Testament too, right? So God has also sort of given us a little stamp off. These are things that we don't need the Old Testament to know or the New Testament to know. We could have known these as a result of reason. But we get a nice little check because Scripture says all of them too. And this is one of the books we do have of Dionysus, the Book of Divine Names. And this book goes on for pages and pages and pages, and very quickly it becomes apparent that he's describing just forms. He's just describing sort of the preeminent forms in late Neoplatonic Proclean thought, and all of these forms are those. And so, yeah, that he's basically just doing late pagan philosophy here, and pointing out that the Bible authorizes us to say most of this. There's one place that he wildly cheats. One of these things, we can say that God is loving. Right? And the reason he gives for this, to justify why, he uses the Greek word eros, which is the word for basically lust. So maybe God is lusting. Let's just translate it that way. Like we can describe God as lusting, and he goes through such enormous hoops to try to justify why he's allowed to say this, because actually the word eros does not appear, at least in any sort of positive sense, in either the New or the Old Testament. So but it is a word. But this word eros is a word that late pagan philosophers were using all over the place. So you can sort of get a sense of that this is supposed to be sort of basically the stuff that you can do with pagan philosophy. The stuff that you get by reason. So we're still not describing God himself, but we are describing God, what we can know about God or infer about God from the things that we can tell that God has done. But we don't even have to stop there. We can keep going. We can describe God imagistically or metaphorically in terms of sensible and perceptible things. And again, this is done all throughout Scripture, particularly the Old Testament does this all over the place. But there's even instances of it in the New Testament too, right? So I can describe God as a rock. Or like when the burning bush appears to Moses, I can describe God as fire. Right? These are images, right? These are we're sort of descending downward as we sort of go through this trajectory, right? We're going down here. This is a descent from God as he really is to God more and more just as in terms of creation. And indeed, the Old Testament is literally, I mean, if you actually read the Old Testament says just absolutely crazy stuff about God at various places. At one point, it's described that like Abraham saw the shoulder of God out of the corner of his eye. It's like, what does that possibly mean? And Dionysus is suggesting metaphors descending downward to the lowest possible level. Now we're talking about the sensible world, the world as it can be perceived, and using that to describe God. Right. So we have describing God as he is in himself, describing God as he can be known by reason, describing God as he can be known through sensation. Right? And this is sort of the progress of the affirmative theology or the positive theology. Let's just pause for a second. This isn't the weird stuff yet. How are we doing with the positive or the affirmative theology? Is the idea here making sense, right? It's sort of, we're taking that sort of trajectory from the one to the forms to sensible things, and then we're just describing God under all those aspects, so going downward farther and farther away from God. Okay. So we're good here. What's the problem with doing all of this? Is God a rock? Go ahead, Tim.
So I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but is this kind of similar to the Islamic Tawheed?
Yes, it's similar.
Like, Tawheed is a whole theology on how you're supposed to think about God.
Yep.
And it's very similar to this, where it's like you're doing it wrong if you're thinking about it in this way or that way.
Right. I don't know enough about it to say with that in particular that there's direct influence. There's definitely direct influence on Sufi thought. Sufi thought definitely comes out of some Neoplatonic stuff. And there's also direct influence from some of the like the Illuminationist school of Islamic thought. So yes, you're not jumping ahead. That is indeed the kind of move that's being made here.
And well, this might be like way ahead, but it also kind of seems similar to I have taken a couple of Zen philosophy classes, and like Dogen has a whole writing where he's kind of slagging the Pure Land Buddhists, and he's like, oh well, they're not going to be damned because of it, but they're thinking of realization and liberation in the wrong ways.
Yeah,
That's
right.
basically what he says.
It's a little bit different in that context because Dogen is going to want to rigorously insist again and again and again that there's nothing transcendent happening here, that Buddha nature is not something transcendent. Then that's not exactly his word for it, but the equivalent of transcendent, the Buddha
Yeah, he
nature
says
is
something
not that.
like, the exact line is something like realization is here and now,
Yeah, exactly.
or it can be realized here and now. Like he says, it's not gonna, like, it might help you out to chant Amida Buddha's name, but you shouldn't expect to wake up one day in the Pure Land, like a literal
Right.
Pure.
In any sort of literal Pure Land, and he's also trying to distinguish, because when you get to later Zen Buddhism, it starts to sound a little bit like Hinduism, and he really clearly wants to distinguish it from that too, and say, no, the Hindus are transcendentalists. They believe that Brahman is something beyond, above reality. We're not. Buddha nature is not beyond anything. Buddha nature is here and now.
Well, and that's kind of the question I wanted to ask: is isn't it tricky when it comes to Buddhism? Because couldn't you interpret the Pure Land Buddhism as almost being akin to Christianity?
Some people have. Some people have indeed done that. We're not going to predominantly talk about Pure Lands Buddhism because it's not really that philosophical of a school. There's not really that much to say about it philosophically. But yeah, I mean, it's at the very least going to be a very open question whether or not there's anything resembling an idea of transcendence in Buddhism. Taylor was arguing that there is. He has a case to be made, but Buddhist authors themselves, especially in the Mahayana tradition, continually insist that there is not. that is a mischaracterization of what they're saying. So perhaps jumping ahead a smidge, but at least that is indeed where we're going. We're going to those questions very directly. All right, good. Any other questions about this sort of affirmative theology, this idea of the affirmative theology? All right. By and large, Protestant Reformation loves all this stuff. Protestant Reformation is like, yep, great, do all the affirmative theology you want. That's fine, right? Why? Well, one, it's heavily scriptural, right? And there's at least in some implicit sense that all of this can be referred back to scripture in some sense, because there's so much scripture you can find basically anything you want to say. But not only that the Protestants like it, actually just the Catholic world in general just really likes affirmative theology. When St. Anselm basically does philosophy for the first time in the Catholic world after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there's about a 400-year gap where nothing is happening in Europe, the Dark Ages. And there's about a 400-year period where there's basically no philosophy to speak of happening either. When St. Anselm is restarting it, he's basically doing this affirmative theology thing. He's right there with it. And everyone following from him really likes doing this affirmative theology thing. There's not a lot, that's where people sort of start, right? Because this is sort of just scientific talking. You get to say all kinds of statements that are just unambiguously true as a result of this. I can just say a sentence like God is good, and that more or less means what you think it means. God is just. More or less means what you think it means. God is my rock. More or less means what you think it means, right? All of these sorts of sentences, they just mean basically what they seem to mean. The extent to which Aquinas actually endorses and uses the negative theology is actually a little bit unprecedented in the Western thought. It just doesn't have as much of a role in Western thinking. And the constant rejoinder that the Eastern Orthodox Church makes against Catholicism and Protestantism, the Eastern Orthodox Church continually just says, all of you people in the West are just way too intellectual. You're way too scientific. You just want to make a bunch of scientific little statements about God, and you completely lose who God is and all of these true things that you say about him. Right? You sort of quite literally lose the actual forest through all the trees that you're planting. All right, so how are we doing? Is affirmative theology, is that okay? This should be sort of the normal stuff. Nothing should be too shocking here. Now let's get shocking. Dionysius says, okay, now that you've done all of this, now you've begun. Now you can finally start the real thing. Now you can start the negative theology. So let's start talking about the negative theology. The only problem, and it's a minor little detail, the only problem with the affirmative theology is that every single one of those sentences I just wrote is false and blasphemous and an insult. So, minor little problem. Because God, why? Why is this the case? Because God is not a good thing. In the same way that I sometimes am a good thing. God is the source of goodness itself. And to characterize God in terms of what God has made is to get the order wrong. That's a backwards order. God has to be far beyond goodness to be the source of it. Add my O. Right. The source of something must be better, superior to the thing that it makes. And this is a basic Platonic principle. And Dionysius was like, yeah, if we're taking that sentence seriously, when you say God is good, you are actually insulting God. You are selling short just how good God actually is. The goodness of God is a goodness beyond goodness. A transcendent goodness, and so therefore an unintelligible goodness. One that you yourself do not have the capacity to grasp. The way this gets put in Western thought, and it's a related idea, this sometimes gets called God's simplicity. That to be good is the same as to be just, is the same as to be powerful in God. But that is never true in the world. The idea here is that it's saying God is good is almost just, that's selling it short just how good God is. God is way more good than whatever it is you're thinking in your mind when you think the word good. God is way more just than whatever thing, I emphasize this thing word, right? Whatever thing you are thinking of in your mind when you think of justice. God is way more powerful than whatever thing you're thinking of when you think of a powerful guy. Right? Like, how do people talk about God all the time? Just like in really basic ways. Like, God is like a king, right? Okay, great. No, that's actually backwards. Kings are pale, puny little imitations of God. God is not a king. That's insulting to God. Kingship is way below God. And so to say God is kingship or whatever, like Dionysus does in the Nine Names, you're just getting God wrong. You're selling God short. It is really fundamentally a philosophical point. You're literally just getting the order wrong. You're saying it backwards. Right? Kings are like God. God is not like kings. It's an asymmetrical likeness, an asymmetrical relationship. Right. Let me give you an example of what I mean by an asymmetrical here. This is something that my wife's mother always would say to her, and it always would drive my wife nuts because it's actually kind of insulting when applied to human beings. But so my wife's mother would always said to her, "No, Christy, you're not like I'm not like you. You're like me. I came first." Right? As if my wife is an imitation of my mother-in-law, not the other way around, right? That's what I mean by an asymmetrical relationship. It's sort of a priority relationship, right? The thing that comes first has priority over what it generates. So God generates good things, but God has priority over those good things. And to say that therefore God is good, whatever you're thinking of by good thing, you're getting the priority wrong. You're saying that God is like what he made rather than the creation is a pale reflection or a pale image of God in some sense. Again, you can see why my wife would get pissed off by that, right? That my wife is just a pale reflection of my mother-in-law or something, right? But with God, it's not actually insulting, right? Because it's a priority difference, right? God is indeed transcendent in this way, right? So when we're doing affirmative theology, we're kind of just insulting God left and right if we stay there. If we don't realize the limitation of everything it is that we've said about God and how short it actually falls of the truth about what God actually is. And so this is what leads to the necessity for negative theology. Negative theology is a corrective of the limitations of affirmative theology. In negative theology, we say what God is not. And but when we say not, we mean it in the sense that he's beyond. Or what he transcends. Right? So how do we start? Well, we start where we left off. We left off talking about sensible things. So God is not a sensible thing. He's way better and cooler. Right? He's far superior. So God is not a rock. Right? Because why not? We can make this really explicit. Why is God not a rock? Because rocks just sit there and are boring and don't do anything and are stupid. And God's not any of those things. God is not a plant. Why not? Well, again, plants are actually cooler than rocks. They at least grow and move and do some stuff, right? And so I'm better off saying that it's better to say that God is a plant than to say that God is a rock, right? Plants are better than rocks, so plants come closer. And God is not an animal. Because again, animals are cooler than plants. God is not a human being. Again, human beings are better than animals, but still fall short in various sorts of ways. All right, I exhaust the sensible world. God isn't any of these things. Note, though, that there's still better and worse things to say. It's better to say God is a human being than it is to say God is a rock. Human beings have various properties that rocks don't have, right? Human beings are, at least in principle, maybe not in fact, but in principle at least, we are capable of wisdom. we're capable of understanding, we're capable of just behavior. Rocks aren't capable of any of those things, so since we're more capable, we're closer to God. But even still, God's not a just thing. I mean, human beings can sin. God can't sin, right? So again, God's better. But we don't just stop there. God is also not an intelligible thing either. God is not, and then these are just great. God is not a being, which sounds like you're saying God doesn't exist. God is not just. But of course, he's not unjust either. And indeed, you're way better off saying that God is just than you would be saying God is unjust. Just is closer, but still it's infinitely off. That's a weird thing, right? Like, it's more right to say that God is just than to say that he's unjust, but both of them are infinitely wrong. Both of them still infinitely miss the mark. God isn't wise, but of course he's not stupid. And again, you're way better off saying wise than you are stupid. But both of them are wrong. Both of them, even wise, which is more of a compliment, even saying that God is wise still falls so thoroughly short of how wise God actually is, right? Of the depths of what it means for God to be as wise as he is, right? We end up by getting rid of all of the intelligible things too. Right? To the extent that at the end of this process, it sounds like we're saying God doesn't exist. But notice that's not actually what we're saying, right? What we're saying is that God is beyond existence. And why? Because he is the source of all existence. This is the negative theology. The negative theology is this practice of saying all of the things that God is not. All of the things that fall short of God. And it's the opposite order, in effect, right? You sort of go down in the affirmative theology from you start with what God is most like and end up with what he's least like, rocks. And then you sort of go back in the opposite order and take everything back. Nope, he's not any of that stuff. Nope, he's not any of that stuff. Nope, he's not any of that stuff. Till the end, we're left with silence. You're left with holy silence. There is nothing you can say. You realize, you discover the inadequacy of anything you could ever say about God and how short it falls of what God actually is. All right. So how's this idea of the negative theology? Is this making sense? Do you all following along reasonably well enough of with sort of what's going on almost just like philosophically with the negative theology? Okay. Why would you ever do it? And let's end here for the day. Why would you ever do this negative theology? What's the point of it? Right? You don't end up with the affirmative theology. It vaguely makes sense why you would do that, right? What do you end up with at the end of the affirmative theology? You end up with a bunch of true stuff about God that you can say. Great, that's useful. I can see why that would help in various sorts of ways, right? I can just say things when I go to church. But what am I getting out of the negative theology? Tim, go ahead.
So I don't know if this is close, but with the Tawhid, it's supposed to be the end goal is you're successfully able to mentally conceptualize God in the correct way.
Yeah, only it's not exactly mentally conceived, but yeah, that's the right, because it's sort of the opposite. I'm like able to unmentally conceive God.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of what it is it's like like, because like the way Professor Hamid described it in his Islam class is like,
Yeah.
you kind of do start with this positive theology of like contemplating God through his sensible acts, but then you, on the back end of it, you spend time contemplating God is not this, not that, not the other, and at the end of it, you're supposed to come up with the correct perception or whatnot.
Yeah. And at least here anyway, so for Dionysus, it's not going to be the correct perception or image or whatever. You're going to become empty of all perceptions.
Well, and that's part of the correct perception, oddly
Right.
enough. It's a
It's sort of, and a little bit, it's just a
thing.
terminological debate a little bit. But yeah, like,
Yeah.
how do we, at least Dionysus is going to emphasize more the negative. That's the emphasis, at least he's going to give, is make yourself empty of all perceptions, imaginations, and thinking. Empty of all things. So what can fill you?
God.
God. If you're empty of all things, you can become full of God. And I see you, Nick. Give me 1 second. I'm going to write something down, and then you'll be next. When you empty yourself of all things, what is literally left? God. God is all that's left. Right? Because God is not a thing. It's not nothing that's left, right? It's literally no thing that's left. Well, what's the no thing? God. God is the source of all things, so he is not a thing. Right? You become empty of God to become empty of everything, become empty of the world to become full of God. Nick, go ahead. Hold on. No, sorry. Okay, there you go. You were not. Try again. You were muted for some.
Oh, no problem. It seems like theology is almost to express how we can't understand the totality of God.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost to be that it seems to be an all-winning argument almost, that it's like, oh, you can't even argue against God because he's beyond your words to comprehend.
Right. Yeah. Quite literally. Yeah.
God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it just seems to be this all-winning thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
If we can't
right.
find him, then he's beyond. Then he's beyond everything, you know.
Right. Yeah, and so it does indeed raise the question: well, okay, why should we talk about this God at all? Right? Right? Like, if we're so why think this is the right way of talking in the first place? And indeed, that's why we'd have to do Plotinus, because Plotinus doesn't have any scriptural reasons that he posits the one, right? Like, he thinks he has good philosophical reasons for talking about this thing, and whether he's right or wrong, yeah, that's a separate question. But at least he thinks he has independent philosophical reasons to say that something like this is needed to get the whole thing going, right? Reasons we can know and understand. But then once we realize that there must be something like this, we realize how inadequate our ability is to comprehend it and describe it, right? So we sort of can realize why we need to talk about it, but then also at the same time realize that we can't talk about it. And if you actually read Plotinus, that's the central puzzle in Plotinus' thought. It's like, there's nothing else worth talking about except for the one, and I can't talk about the one. What can we do? And indeed, you're right. So we could ask the sort of question, okay, why think God exists at all? And Dionysus just isn't doing that, at least here, anyway, right? He's just presupposing this basic Platonic framework that sort of discovers, sort of philosophically, why you need to talk about the one. But yeah, once you've discovered it, so let's say we do have some independent reason to think that we should talk about the one in this way, or talk about this transcendent God in this way, or this hidden God in this way. Once we have that reason, yeah, this is the inevitable result of thinking about what that would mean seriously, right? And so in that sense, it is sort of an indefeatable argument. But what's the point of it? Why bother then, right? Well, the point of it is I can actually transform myself by doing it, right? The goal of negative theology is self-transformation. I transform myself, or maybe better, strip away from myself everything that gets in the way of me actually encountering God. That is an intrinsically monastic project. Or what Nietzsche was calling an aesthetic project. Right? Because what's going to get in the way of me actually understanding God in this model? Literally everything. Again, I want everything, like emphasizing the thing word, right? Everything is going to get in the way. Seeing stuff, everything I see is going to potentially trick me, but also everything I know and understand is going to trick me. To say nothing about the ordinary affairs of like who's going to become the next sheriff in my town. Like that's going to wildly get in the way and that's going to wildly distract me from the real task, right? The goal of this negative theology is this sort of stripping away from myself everything that I really am not, until all that's left of me is God, is the me that is in some sense identical or unified with God. And just as a project, you'd only do this if you were a monastic. This is the higher speed. Right? You actually sort of have to kind of reject mundane happiness. Like, oh, I got a promotion at work today. What a horrible news, because now there's just more stuff to distract me from God. Ooh, I ate a really good meal. Ah, curses, now I'm farther away from God because I've gotten distracted by how good the meal tasted. Right? The normal, mundane kinds of things that we want actually get into the way and distract us from. Right? And so someone's asking, what would be the purpose of creation if we have to sort of reject creation as a whole to really know God? The purpose of it is that it is God. That's actually the bizarre thing on this model. That's its purpose. That's why it exists. And so therefore, it indeed really is good. It's not that creation is bad or evil or sinful or anything like that. And if all I can do is just follow the lower speed, then God has made a beautiful universe for me to do it within. And not only is it beautiful, it constantly speaks of God. Everything I see within it speaks of God. Right? So it's a perfectly good universe. And if that's enough for you, fine. But if you want to know God, then the universe is just a necessary distraction. It is necessary, right? Like, because I had to start by doing the affirmative theology. The affirmative theology does come first. So I had to start by knowing God through creation. But I can't stop there. If I stop there, I'll never be able to really find God. I'll get lost in creation. So I hope that's helpful for the chat question. I hope that's because the question you were sort of asking is actually precisely why Luther and Calvin hate all of this so much. Luther and Calvin just want to be like, no, all of this is dumb. Just like lead a normal, fine life. That's all God wants you to do. Dionysus and what he's proposing, it's a really huge task. And it's not one that everyone needs to fulfill. But if you want to know God in the highest sense, you've got a big task. And when Nietzsche absolutely savages Calvin and Luther. He despises them. The reason he despises them is because he at least thinks there's something, he thinks it's ridiculous, but there's at least something noble and impressive about just the aspiration behind this monastic ideal. He respects it just as like, almost as, put it this way, he almost just respects their balls. Like, look at the balls of these guys, they think they can know God. Right? Whereas Luther and Calvin are just like, no, just like be little piddly economic subjects and eat a lot of food. And Nietzsche's just like, oh, the last man. Like the death of everything cool in Christianity, with the sort of the little piddling, just lead your small little piddling life, and that's all God wants from you. So hopefully, at least this was a lot of this. So this is going to be helpful for a couple of different ways. Hopefully what we just went over with Dionysus is going to be helpful. First of all, just articulating why in the Middle Ages there were these two speeds, the higher and lower speed. Why someone would posit the transcendent realm as necessary in some sense, and why the ascetic ideal that Nietzsche sort of savaged, if he's wrong, why did people ever think it was a good idea in the first place? So hopefully it was helpful for all of that. Also, this is all going to really help us when we turn to the Islamic world. We didn't even get to the Islamic world today, which is fine. When we turn to the Islamic world, this is going to be really helpful because the way that Plato comes to the Islamic world, it's not through Dionysus himself, but it is through late Proclean Platonism. And so a lot of the stuff that Dionysus is saying is where a lot of the Islamic thinkers are going to start from too, just like Tim was suggesting earlier. So that I think whether it's direct influence, and in a lot of cases it is direct influence, or if it's just a convergence of similar ideas, a lot of the stuff we're talking about today will be very helpful for understanding what's going on in the Islamic context too. So we're already well over. I've already kept you too long. Thank you all very much. Hope this was coherent and intelligible. We'll start with Al-Farabi on Tuesday. I think we'll only need a day for what we're going to do with Al-Farabi. We'll see. We'll take longer if we need it. Have a great weekend, everyone. And I'll talk to you all later. Yeah, have a good one.
Thank you.